Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Raw Knowledge Podcast. Real conversations, raw knowledge with even more talented people. And it's been an interesting start to this podcast. Zoom, well, it's had some upgrades. I don't know if it's upgrades or some side steps, but it's interesting. I've got with me this morning the wonderful and wise Steve Taylor. Steve, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me on.
Mate, pleasure. We've got all the mics. We've got about 4, haven't we, at the minute?
2 each.
So you guys should be getting some phenomenal audio by the time this comes out. But yeah, it's interesting. Zoom has decided to do some different things. Nonetheless, we're here. Steve, tell the people where you are, what time zone you're in, where you reside in the world. I always think it's good to build a bit of a picture.
So I am in Kansas City, Missouri. It's basically right in the middle of the United States. And I'm on the central time zone. So yep, basically just right in the Midwest, cornfields and cows and that area.
Sounds like a good setting for a horror movie. I'm thinking Signs.
Yes, which is a great movie.
It is. It's one of my favorite alien movies. I think it's one of the most believable, actually, to be fair. Are you guys coming into summer now, actually?
Yes. Yep. Basically just starting it.
There you go. So here in Australia, in the Gold Coast, what we can call winter. It was this morning. We had a low of 14 degrees. I know that's terrible. A lot of people will be like, that's not even winter, but it's cold to us. Anyway, Steve, let's start off as we always do and tell the people. I know some of the listeners will be familiar because they are a fan of Muscle 3D, 3D MJ, I should say, 3D Muscle Journey, and a couple of other guests, of which you're probably in collaboration with. But tell us who you are, what you do, and more importantly, why you do it.
So I am a registered dietitian. I have a master's degree in nutrition, exercise physiology, and dietetics. And my practice is solely focused on helping people develop sustainable habits. And I do that basically through focusing on 3 areas: what we eat, how we move, and then how we think. It's probably the simplest, shortest elevator pitch I can give.
Mate, that's brilliant. I was just going to say that's concise. Did you have that prepared beforehand? That was just to the point.
I did not, but I think I've used that before. I'm pretty sure that's like basically what's on my website. So it just like fell out.
It's like that, isn't it? They always say, though, you should know when someone says, what do you do? You should always have a very good verbiage. Like, you obviously don't want to have it to be something that's not cognizant, but it should be something that's a little bit different, but it really, in a lay term, explains not your title, but it's like, this is what I do for people. So, and I love the sustainability. Audience know that's something that's going to resonate with me greatly, and that's what I want to talk about today. And it doesn't necessarily have to just be in the realms of nutrition, but before we do dive into some more specific or pointy-ended questions, what was the protagonist that led you into this field or this area? Was there any events? Was it something that you always wanted to do? Was it a friend that inspired you? Perhaps talk us through that first.
The first thing that got me into just this whole space was for high school sports. So back going into freshman year, so I think around 14, I started lifting weights to get better at sports, and then basically started falling more in love with weights than I did with sports. And so I stopped playing American football, started lifting full time. And then basically I started thinking about, okay, well, what's going to help me perform better in the gym? I started studying nutrition, basically just started snowballing from there. Went on to get my undergrad in nutritional sciences, and then on to get my master's. And then from there, it was like, well, this information is cool. It's helped me out a lot. Maybe I should turn this into a business and share it with other people because it has such an impact on my life. And that's kind of where it evolved.
Yeah. It's you mentioned, is it NFL, American football? Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. I imagine like, with what I've heard from my friends overseas, that's generally something that goes hand in hand with the weights. Seems to be what has inspired a lot of people. And I've also noticed a lot of people going, well, actually, I really like this weights thing. And it could be due to injury, or perhaps they just go, oh, you know what, this is a way I can still lift and look good and I don't have to get hurt. And it's amazing how sometimes you can change that trajectory. Now, you've competed quite a few times, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. You've done, is it physique sports? Have you done any powerlifting as well, or is it just sort of more in the physique arena?
Just on the physique side of stuff.
Okay,
So
fair enough.
I competed in 3 different seasons. I think it was 2012, 2015, and 2016. And then basically that's 2015, 2016 was when I was working on my master's. And during that time, I thought I wanted to work with solely like getting people ready for competitions and meets and photo shoots and things like that. Started my practice that way, but then just slowly over time, I started to fall more in love with developing sustainable habits and like that aspect versus just prepping somebody for a specific event. So it kind of like that's kind of how my own journey and then my practice evolved kind of hand in hand with that.
Yeah. Well, that's a really salient point there, Steve. I like that a lot. Resonates with me because I was in the same, I guess, or a similar boat where I thought I was going to be doing more athletes from a physique standpoint, looking performance. And I still love that. And I still work with some of those athletes. But what I've found is I've fell into a role which is actually teaching people more sustainability, like taking the lifestyle aspect as a whole and looking at, if we were to break it down into a trifecta of training, nutrition, and lifestyle, looking at how those areas complement each other, but how they affect each other, and then also giving people tools and helping them sustain behaviors and habits over time. So it's, well, we don't just have to look great for stage, but we can actually look good all year, but we don't have to be completely shredded, and we can do it without any psychological adversity, eating disorders, energy deficiencies and the like. So I think, I'd love to talk more about that. Perhaps we can talk through some of the complementing skill sets. So for example, we look at a physique athlete and we go, right, we need precision, we need motivation, we need drive, we've got to be on the money. However, and I always say, I use this verbiage where we live in the real world, right? And the real world is very unpredictable. And I don't like to use the word general population because I don't think anyone is general. I think we're all individual. But let's say, for example, we've got Mary. Mary's got 3 kids. She's got a bad back. She doesn't know how to track her nutrition. And, she can only get the gym 3 days a week. Now, that client is going to be quite common. A lot of people will go, oh, yeah, I've got a client similar like that. Sometimes we think as practitioners can come straight out of school qualifications and we get all these clients and they're just going to be like hitting the macros and hitting their training, and it doesn't work like that, right? So perhaps talk us through like your initial experience, if you have any to share along these lines, where you went, okay, I thought I was going to do the physique stuff, and you did, but then maybe moving towards individuals which didn't have necessarily the performance goals, but they wanted to implement something which is going to be a reoccurring theme here, which is sustainable. And I guess that transition between that and what are some of those skills look like, and then we can sort of go through and unpack it a little bit more specifically.
I would say just kind of, I guess we'll say, shifting clientele like that, population like that. Typically, some of the first people that I worked with who are from that physique, natural bodybuilding, natural powerlifting community, they already have a very strong skill set in terms of like they know how to track and like they understand all that to the T. Where it's like once I started working with people who didn't come from that background, it's like you said, they'd never tracked before, never really paid attention to it. So I basically just had to adjust my systems to account for that. So basically what I like to do with everyone, like when we start off with, I would say not everyone, but let's say 95% of people, unless they have some reason why we shouldn't be doing that, is starting off with a period of tracking. So I just feel like, I'm sure you've noticed this as well with your clients, like just the process of tracking itself just teaches us so much about food. Because it's like until we like closely study like calories and nutrition, nothing really means anything. Like we can look at a menu and we see, okay, this thing is 1,200 calories, but like we don't know what that means for us. It's just generally 1,200 calories, but we don't know, okay, is that like 50% of my day's calories? Is that 20% of my day's calories? Is that 90%? So it's like just that process of tracking and kind of lets the person figure out, okay, if I want to maintain my weight or lose weight, this is where my daily calories need to be. So I love that. And I also love just like through that tracking process, if somebody hasn't really studied food that closely, it provides like I don't know, it's a simple way to like help them get used to looking at their food, and they learn a lot about food just through tracking without having to like read a bunch of random stuff or this or that. It's like, hey, just track, and just through the process of tracking, you'll learn a bunch about different foods.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll stop there, but that's basically where I like to start. Is like with anyone, unless they have a reason why we shouldn't, is just starting with a period of tracking, just so they can learn a lot about food and about their body's needs.
Mm. I'm going to and ask a question that has a few threads on it, which kind of relate to that, which I think is important. It's going to play devil's advocate here a little bit for the listeners. So I love the fact that you mentioned the awareness, and I think that's great. A lot of people think, oh, we're tracking for tracking. It's like, no, no, no. You actually become aware of what's in food, right? You get this sort of calibration where, like you said, you had nothing before to compare it to. And now it's okay. This is kind of what I'm aiming for in a daily energy intake. So now this does have some, numerical significance, or, oh, wow, I didn't realize this food was high in fat or low in protein or whatever it is. And it just creates that initial kind of, segue into being able to get closer to the body composition goals or whatever it might be, health goals. Well, have you experienced any pushback from a client? So, for example, where they go, oh, yeah, I don't really want to track, or they might not verbally say that, but they just don't do it. And we've got to kind of unpack, well, why are they not tracking? And is there any other mediums and tools you will implement when that happens? So, for example, it might be going back to some basics and go, hey, look, I just want you to have X amount of meals a day. I want the protein servings to be this size, and we might use palmfuls or whatever it is, keeping it really simple. And if so, how do you then transition that person to doing what we might call like a food diary or a 7-day recall? I'll leave it there, but there is another element to that, because I want to sort of talk about, I know if you do a lot of work online, I believe, like how you would then do that with an online versus an in-person client and what that might look like. Because I really want to get into the grainy details in this one, because I know that all these little gray areas are where it falls apart, right? We kind of know the big overarching themes, but I think this stuff is the really important stuff that we actually come in contact with as practitioners and then go, oh yeah, actually, what's the step in between the steps? Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I guess to reiterate, yeah, if you do get any pushback, what does that look and sound like? And if you do have to take another step back or break it down even further, again, what does that look like for you? And maybe there's other skills that we're overlooking here, or I'm overlooking.
In terms of pushback, basically, like before I start anyone like into my program, we do like an initial phone call just to talk things through. And like during that phone call, just kind of ask them, hey, where's your motivation at, to do just in a very general, like, hey, where's your motivation at to like do this stuff? So typically, if the person's not super motivated, we typically wouldn't even get rolling. We would wait until they're ready to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Then from there, if they're motivated and wanting to do it, they might say things like, I don't necessarily want to track, but I know that it's going to be helpful for me to do so. Mm-hmm. And so the pushback might be in that sense. It's not like, hey, I refuse to track or like this or that. It's kind of like, I'm not looking forward to it, but I know it's a part of the process. I know it'll help me in the long run. So yeah, I when it comes to starting with someone, if somebody's not to the place where they want to do that, I would just question how motivated they really are. Because it's not like it's a massive thing they have to do. And there's other, like you said, there's other ways we could do it. But I've just found they're not quite as effective as like just tracking.
I guess to kind of like, sorry to butt in there, Steve. If you were to say, okay, this person is not going to, they're motivated, but they can't track. Is there a category of person that, and this is probably a few people that fall into this, say, for example, someone has an eating disorder, like anorexia nervosa or something like that. Is that when you would go, okay, maybe now we're just using some, because you might not want to, I don't know. Again, this is maybe not within my scope, but, okay, well, we don't want to kind of entice or increase that, because maybe they're going to look at it and go, fuck, I have to keep reducing or increasing. Is there any sort of client that falls into that bracket where you go, okay, we don't track with this person until they have this level, of, I guess, I get psychology or recovery, and then we can get them into tracking? Or is it no, we can always influence or be able to introduce tracking to someone as long as they, want to do it?
So that would be the population where like 5 minutes ago I like hesitated like 95%, because that would be the 5% where it's like
Right.
I would
Cool.
not force tracking upon them. Basically in that situation, and it's like this with everyone, like just getting clear, like what are our outcomes, what are we after, and then
Mhm.
from there, what's going to be the best method to get there. And typically, like a lot of people who have struggled with disordered eating behaviors, they've tried different things, and so they know what works best for them, what things cause them more anxiety. So I lean heavily on their own experience in those situations. Like, hey, like yourself, like we know our goal is to gain weight, so we know we have to make that outcome happen.
Mhm.
But I want to do that in a way that's going to be the least anxiety inducing, and the way that's going to be most effective. And so that's where it's like we might do something else. We might not track. We might do so many meals per day, or like whatever that ends up looking like. But that would be a great example of like not forcing tracking onto someone.
Perfect. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to like identify if there was a population where it's like, okay, no, for you, this is fair enough. We need to have another strategy. But okay, so I guess diving back in then, we've got someone tracking, or we start off with a food diary. Now you mentioned, and again, we'll put the links, in the description below to some of the resources that you've done, which are phenomenal. When you are working with someone one-on-one versus online, what are the differences when you are looking at tracking? Do you usually send them these video resources if someone is online? Can you generally just communicate that to them? And, what mediums are you prescribing? Obviously, most people will be familiar with MyFitnessPal. Is there any others that you found useful? Is that the main one? And then perhaps, any other resources that you find helpful for the in-person versus the online client. And if there is, there might not be any differences, Steve. Again, I'm just playing devil's advocate here for the listeners, because I don't want to miss any of these little bits to a degree.
Yeah, those are great questions. So basically, there's a video on 3D Muscle Journey's YouTube page. It's how to track I think it's how to track macros or something, but it's not necessarily how to track macros. It's how to use MyFitnessPal and how to track your nutrition. So basically, that's the video that I send people, is like, hey, like here's just basics, how you get into MyFitnessPal, how you do these things, which kind of answers your second question, which I typically at this point have just stuck with MyFitnessPal. It's free. You don't need the premium version. It
Mm-hmm.
lets the person organize according to meals. So I mean, it does all the basic things. And then sometimes with also like startups, so I'll have the tutorial for how to track. I'll send them, hey, set up here MyFitnessPal, and then I'll also send over some of my uh, other resources, which are some of the things that cause people to eat like when they're not necessarily hungry. So I might send them like that how to track video came as part of a course called Sustainable Fat Loss. And like in that course, I talk about emotional eating. I talk about how we use food as a vehicle to change the way we feel if we're bored or lonely or stressed. So sometimes along with that initial tracking video, I'll say, hey, go ahead and give this a review just to start looking at the material. Nothing you have to do right now, but just you can start looking at this stuff and see if anything resonates with you when you watch this. And then the other thing, kind of all part of the onboarding process, is like, hey, like as we get started, I want you to, because like when I started tracking, it was almost like blind tracking. Like I really didn't pay that much attention to food. I was just solely focused on the numbers. And
Mm-hmm.
because of that, I didn't get the most useful information for long-term sustainability. I got really good at like memorizing the macros of a meal,
Mm-hmm.
but I was so zoomed in and granular that I missed things. So like I'll tell people at the beginning, like, hey, like just know that like this tracking period is like training wheels. Like you're just going to be doing this for a few months or 6 months or however long it is, and then we're going to start moving away from it. So it's like start like studying foods and just looking a little more like bird's eye view of like, okay, what a portion size is, and like what 30 grams of protein from chicken looks like, and all that stuff. So I'll just kind of load people with all that up front. It's like, hey, this is a temporary phase we're going through to learn. And like as you go through it, I want you to study food, because knowing that you're not going to be micromanaging your nutrition like this forever.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that's really valuable And that's, again, what gets people within the ballpark. And I love the analogy of training wheels. It's something that I like to use as well, like stabilizers on a bike. I'm like, it's not forever. Before we sort of get towards the end of that journey, you know, and we talk about moving away from tracking and you know, the nuances that come with that. So I'm a client. My name's Alex. We've gone through that initial process. I'm tracking my food on MyFitnessPal. We're touching base once a week, maybe bi-weekly. I'm not sure how you would run it with your athletes, depending on the level of who you're working with. But what are some of the things then that we're looking at, or how you're coaching in regards to what you're seeing and the feedback you're giving the client from what they're tracking, for example, to share, or we'll start off very similar, or like get people to a diary recall. I'll say, hey, look, if possible, MyFitnessPal, send them a resource so they know how to use it. A lot of people are familiar, as you know now, Steve, because it seems to be an up and coming thing. A lot of people are more aware about the nutrition than ever, especially with COVID, you know, eating at home, being more sedentary. People are more adept at, hey, you know what, I really need to look after my physical health, therefore looking after my mental health. So, you know, they're tracking it, or, you know, might say, hey, look, if you can't do that initially, take some pictures of your food so we can kind of see what you're eating, break it down, or even go completely old school pen and paper, right? But so I'm doing that. And then I'm looking initially at, so I would generally touch base with someone weekly and then going, okay, well, because people often, and I don't know if you get this, we'll just digress slightly, go, give me a meal plan. It's like, okay, right. Just give me a meal plan. Now, I think we should talk about this because, again, this is a tool. But when used wisely, it's a very great tool. It's good structure. But I think in the early days, if you just give someone a meal plan, you're not really teaching them anything. And, you know, it's actually providing more restriction, because they might go, well, shit, if I don't eat everything on this meal plan, then, you know, like I'm failing, right? So maybe talk about when you would implement a meal plan versus not, and then the pros and cons about that, I guess, before we digress into the specifics, if possible, please, Steve.
Yep. So basically, and this kind of leads back to like starting, like how I start people with tracking is like the first thing I have people do is just track. Mm-hmm. So I don't have them alter their eating patterns at all, but it's like, hey, basically just keep eating the way you've been eating the last 6 months, but just track it. So that's the way I started. And then I might assign fruits and veggie targets, maybe a protein target from there, but I still haven't altered when they eat their meals or how they space things out. It's just like, hey, I just want you to keep eating the way you have been, eat more fruits and veggies, and just track it. Yeah. Then from there, once they've just gotten more comfortable with tracking, like my whole process is just like, it's just slow like that, like slowly changing things. From there, I might walk people through like building a flexible eating routine. And a resource we can link, Eric wrote a really good book called blog called The Default Diet, which is basically, instead of writing, like you said, a specific meal plan with, hey, these specific foods at these specific times, it's basically just like, hey, like, here's just generally like a good time for breakfast, like based on, like, I'll go through their day. Hey, when do you wake up? Like, when do you like to eat breakfast? When do you start work? When do you like to eat lunch? When do you this? And I'll just walk through based on all of their preferences. And then based on, like, if I see a huge gap, like I typically like try to get it to where people aren't eating, like aren't going longer than 5 hours without eating. Mm-hmm. And not there's anything magical about that. It's just, I found that like that 5 hour line is kind of like, after that, people tend to overeat. If somebody goes 6-7 hours without eating, and then they sit down to have a meal, it ends up being a lot of food. So basically, if I don't see that the person's having something to eat within every 5 hours, I might make a suggestion for throwing, you know, hey, this might be a good time to plug this thing in there. Mm-hmm. But that's basically how I do it. It's like, hey, let's look at your actual life and just like, hey, when do you like to eat? Build it that way. And then I might give a couple of suggestions, like, so they don't go too long without eating. I might help them plug in, like, hey, I like people to build all of their main meals around protein, fruits, and veggies. So I might be like, okay, like, we know that your daily goals are 2 fruits a day and 4 veggies a day. So maybe with breakfast, like, it doesn't matter what your fruit is, but just get a fruit in with breakfast. And then with lunch, get another fruit in and get 2 veggies in. And then with dinner, get 2 veggies in. Like, I might do stuff like that. So it's like this flexible, like, hey, here's a way you can space out your protein, your fruits, and your veggies. But it's like very flexible, instead of like, it's not like a banana at this time, an apple at this time. It's like, hey, just a serving of fruit here, a serving of fruit there. And then also letting them know at any point you can tear this up. Like, this is just one way to paint the wall. You can paint the wall any way, as long as by the end of the day you painted the wall. So in this example, it's like, as long as you get your 2 fruits and 4 veggies in, like, by the end of the day, you're good. This is just one way you can do it. But if one morning you wake up late and you have to skip breakfast, it's no big deal. Just have that other fruit later on in the day as a snack or something. Like, so it's just kind of like helping them build that routine, but then also letting them know that it's just one way they can do it and they can tear it up anytime.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable, Steve, having, those basic structures. A lot of the coaches that I work with as well will often ask me, Alex, how in the early days when you're working with a client, like, they need some structure, but you can't give them too much, right? They're like, how does it work? Like, and this is kind of what we're talking about today, which I think is really valuable, Steve. It's, again, the gray areas between like, oh yeah, we track and then we don't track, but like there's a lot that happens in between that. And how do we kind of, work and navigate around that process where the default diet, again, or having that basic, hey, look, it's a good idea to eat X amount of times a day to get X amount of protein, or, we want exactly the fruit and veggie target, where people go, I have I call mine a fearless fundamentals after my business, where I have like, here's all the frequently asked questions. Here's the bare bone basics on everything training and nutrition. It's like hydration, meal timing, warm up, cool down. Just like little, like I've condensed it as much as possible because we don't want to overwhelm people, but like having these basic guidelines gives someone a little bit of a step to go, okay, cool. Like I got something. And obviously you're always going to get people who maybe read a little bit more or go a little bit further with it. But then you're not sort of saying, I use the analogy of like a field, right? I'm like, we need some fences, but if the fences are, they're really small, you can have no space to run around. But if like we make these fences like really huge and you've got all of this acreage, maybe it's going to be a bit too overwhelming initially because, you don't really know where the limits are and you're going to kind of veer off, into the field, into a pond or something. So it's always like finding that happy medium and then obviously like tailoring it to the client. And I guess now we talk about, so, we've got that basic structure. You've sent those resources out. And again, we'll link those because they're super valuable. And then you've got this approach where, again, sustainability. And I think the art to sustainability is making these small, incremental, achievable changes. And I think setting the expectation, probably something we should talk about, really, really important for the client, because sometimes client comes on board and goes, oh, cool, so you're just going to give me a meal plan. I'm going to get like diced in 12 weeks. And it's like, well, we could do that. But that's not going to be sustainable because what happens after the 12 weeks? Like you've used a templated system and now you don't understand hunger cues. You don't understand quantity, quality. It's kind of all over the show. And we see this all the time. I see this all the time with challenges, like 6-week, 12-week challenges. And I'm like, yeah, sometimes they're great because they get people started. But I often find I see people, they just return to normal, or if not worse, after these challenges, and then they sort of sign up for the next one, and it's this constant yo-yo, and then they become the yo-yo dieters. And now we've created another eating disorder, mildly, and it's such a shame. So I think by going, hey, look, this might take a bit longer doing it with these methodologies, but it's going to be much more sustainable in the long run, and you can maintain the look that you want, obviously not stage lean, but a really healthy body composition. But you can now go ahead and you don't have to kind of go through that initial process again. Like we can get you to a level where, okay, cool, we're on this level, and now we can go, right, what's the goal? Is it more performance, or is it more aesthetics, or depending on that? So I guess these small changes that you're making weekly when you're having conversations to a client, what does that look like? Online versus in person might be the same. And what are you looking at? For example, is it, oh, I see this person's not having any protein with breakfast. Their daily protein's low. Are we going to add in something like that? Like, what's the next steps, I guess, building on from, what we've just talked about, that initial sort of awareness or recall phase?
So, and this will actually tie back to some of the stuff where you started with that statement, and then how it evolved into a question. Was like at the beginning, it's just setting clarity on like what are our outcomes versus like what are our methods. So it's like like, hey, your outcomes are 2 fruits a day, 4 veggies a day, X grams of protein per day, whatever. And then because I use a lot of like trial and error. like you said, like I don't want to give somebody too much structure because then it's like there's no flexibility in that. But at the same time, you said if there's no structure, then it's just a lot of decision making, and like there are some like fundamentals that help, like eating, 3 to 5 times a day is like just a solid recommendation. Spreading your protein out, spreading your fruits and veggies out. Like I can give people those guidelines. But from there, I just use a lot of trial and error. Like if I don't give people a ton of structure, like they'll learn for themselves. Like if they wait until 9 p.m. to eat 2 fruits and 4 veggies and 150 grams of protein, they're going to feel horrible and they're never going to do it again.
Yeah.
So it's like, I try to give people the guidance, but at the same time, I'm always like, I'm more of a facilitator as well. Like here's the program that you go through, but like I'm not going to be nagging you, or it's not going to be a ton of structure, because it's like you gonna want this to evolve to fit your personality and your lifestyle. So it's like I'm gonna give you some guidance. I'm like, hey, this is a way that works for a lot of people, but like I'm not gonna force anything. And so then then they have the freedom to try other things. And then, like I said, maybe it ends up like, oh, I shouldn't eat, that much spinach at 10 p.m. Like I kind of felt terrible. So I like that, because it's like they learn in real time through the process, and like, oh, that's why I spread it out versus this and that. You said another thing in there as well, but I'm blanking on that. And then your final question basically was like, okay, what's the evolution look like in terms of how things evolve?
Yeah. So I guess I don't know how frequently you would check in with your clients, but what are you doing before we get to the process of moving away from tracking? How are we, I guess, refining? So if we use, say I'm the client again, and I've come back to you and I've got my tracking, my food diary, and you might go, oh, I see some gaps here, and we sort of bridging those over time. I imagine that's going to be most of it. But is there any other, I guess, steps in between that? And what do you look for with a client in terms of, I guess, markers before you go, okay, we're going to move away from tracking now? Let's say, I guess you would have introduced at this point, and maybe it is we're skipping steps here, or I'm skipping steps, where you go, okay, well, now we're working to calories, now we're working to protein, fats, carbs, fiber, etc. Maybe that's kind of the next thing, but I could be wrong, Steve. I don't know how you run it.
Okay, so yeah, so basically, there's that period where, hey, it's just track, don't change anything, and then like they'll get fruit targets, veggie targets, protein target, calorie targets. Those are kind of my 4 things. Because back to like the very thing you said a long time ago, when I moved from, let's say, physique athletes to non-competitors, it was like, we don't need to be tracking fat and carbs. We can just track calories and make sure we get enough protein and fruits and veggies, and we'll be good. So those are like my 4 targets. The evolution. So there's a few things that happen along the way. At the beginning, I am like, together, we are like, they'll use MyFitnessPal. And the reason I use that is just, it's like you said, versus like pen and paper or whatever, is because this way we both have access to it. I'm sure, I mean, I could have them send over pictures, but it's like this way it's online. We both have access. So it's like during our weekly consultations at the beginning, we'll just both be in MyFitnessPal. And because I know that thing is a mess, and there's a lot, it's confusing. If you've never been in MyFitnessPal and you just start, it's overwhelming. So I will just, it's a mess. So it's like, I'll help like make sure that the things they're tracking and stuff looks accurate. This way, if it doesn't, like we can go through that process together. So this way they're developing like realistic frames of references for things to make sure their tracking is pretty dang accurate of reality. So we'll do that. We'll go through and make sure stuff is looking accurate. The other thing is as early as I can, I like to run like periods of not tracking. So even though, let's say at the beginning, let's say it's a 6-month tracking process, I might, as soon as I can, like, hey, only track 5 days per week, don't track 2 days per week. This way they can start to get exposure to not tracking as early as possible. This way, when we totally transition away, they're already used to it. So that just depends on the person. It's kind of like, again, going back to our outcomes, like, hey, our goal is to lose like 1 to 2 pounds a week, for example. And let's say they're hitting within that range and they're doing it only tracking 5 days a week. Well, that's good. Like, we don't need to track more because you're hitting our outcomes. But like, if we notice that they're not losing that and they're only tracking 5 days, well, maybe we need to track a couple extra days to help with adherence and accountability. So, but like I said, basically it's just like getting people used to not tracking early on, at least a little bit. This way, like on holidays and things like that, this way when we moved away completely, they're already used to it. And then through that whole process as well is helping them to form that structure in their day. So, because I know me, like when I was tracking, I didn't necessarily have a ton of structure, or at least structure that I thought about, because I was only as it was like, as long as I eat this much protein, this much fat, and this much carbs by the end of the day, I'm good. But with that, it was like I didn't have the best structure because I was so focused on those numbers that I didn't really have any habits that led me to those things without having to study them very closely. So it's like with my clients, it's like, okay, how can we get your fruit, veggie, protein, and calorie targets in a way similar to like what's in that blog that we'll link by Eric, which is like, hey, I eat breakfast around this time. It's around this much calories, around this much protein, around this much fruit and veggies. Same with lunch, same with dinner. So I'll help them like get that routine set up. This way, as we move away from tracking, they already have a routine. And so now all it is, hey, you just keep your routine that you spend all that time building, and you just kind of slowly move away from tracking. Because it's like what I always tell them is like, the tracking doesn't necessarily matter at all. The tracking is just telling us what's happening in reality. But as long as like reality is still happening, it doesn't matter whether we write it down or not. So basically, let's build that structure, and then let's just slowly get away from needing to write down that structure, even though you're still doing it in real life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. There's something that was going through my mind then when you were talking is, let's say you've got someone who, has an intention to become a competitor, or they sort of verbalize that to you when you onboard them and say, hey, look, I wouldn't mind competing in the future. So say that is the case with a particular client. Are there any specific markers or outcomes that you'd want to see with that client, or that you speak to them about before we go, hey, well, for example, before we, move into that? Because as we know, when we're looking at physique competitors, there's not really a lot of room for error. I mean, you can definitely have a more flexible approach, but I think that's a more advanced skill in itself. But in the early days, it's, the precision is a lot higher, and we are really tracking macros. So is there a prerequisite to that, Steve, when you're working with the client, say, hey, look, well, once we sort of get to this level of nutrition literacy or adherence and whatever it might be, then we can go, okay, well, let's maybe run a mini cut first, or then we, can, obviously, let's say they're in a position where they've got enough muscle that they are going to compete. But are there any things that you like to see before that is an option? And then obviously we can sort of, we'll say that's the left turn, and maybe the right turn is moving away from tracking, and it's not a physique goal. It might just be more of a sustainability thing.
So a lot of the people that come to me have tried to, and have actually lost weight in the past multiple times. They've lost, regain. So
like
the
yo-yo diet, right?
Well, unintentionally, but yeah, it's like they've tried different methods, and those methods just didn't work, or they didn't fix some underlying behaviors, or the underlying psychology, or whatever it was. But something was not allowing things to stick. And so the reason they reach out is like, hey, I want to like reset my new baseline. Like, I don't want to have to keep losing and regaining. I just want a baseline.
Makes sense.
So if somebody reaches out and they have a decent amount of weight to lose, and they've struggled with losing, regaining. I mean, it's their lives, so they can do what they want to do. But my recommendation is just like, hey, like what I would suggest is just losing the weight, like the good chunk of weight that you want to lose, like get to where you're within, as lean as you can be, and maintain that as it can be easily maintained, and live that for a while. Yes. Like just lose the 50, 60, 70 pounds, live that for a while, like a year or longer, whatever it is. Like just live that for a while, get used to maintaining, reset your baseline. And during that time, lift weights, train hard, focus on building muscle. And then once you kind of reset like really what your normal is, then go ahead and dive into like a contest prep or something, versus like losing the weight and then immediately being like, within a month or two, now I'm going to do this very aggressive cut. Yeah. Because then that can lead to now they regain all the weight they lost in the first place, because they never got that middle ground of just like living and maintaining for like not just a few months, but like a year, like a while, to really reset that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like that a lot. I think people are just too quick to kind of jump into the competitive realm But I think, again, it's a lack of awareness and education, Steve. I don't know if you'd agree there, but, people are well-intentioned. Coaches might see it as an opportunity to make money, take money off people. But, I think that someone has to be of a certain physical and mental capacity before, going into, if you really are going to get, stage lean, it's no joke. And we see it all the time, right? How many competitors, may look on the surface healthy, or what people would see desirable from social media, but in the background they are just literally switching between this binary, really aggressive cutting, really aggressive bulking, and that's their life. They just go through these phases and seasons, if you will, where if you said, hey, no black, no white, let's live in gray, just maintain this, could they do it? Well, no, perhaps those skills aren't there. So I think having the best interest of the person you work with at heart in the long run is well and truly underrated. So in that sense, I guess this is a nice little dovetail into then, say we have someone, and again, we can say I'm the client again, and you've got me to where, my nutrition literacy is great. I've been tracking. I've lost the weight I wanted to lose. I'm sort of weight stable, if you will. I'm maintaining a leaner physique. I'm saying not tracking on the weekends. I'm just doing 5 days. What are the next steps to move me away completely from tracking, and what are the levels to that?
So basically, let's say we finish a fat loss phase, like you said, and like, okay, we're ready to shift to maintenance. Before I completely move somebody away, what I like to do is figure out, so they have the information, like where their calorie intake needs to be based on their activity. So like, let's say we've had their daily activity high and we've had their calories low. Well, it's like basically, well, what amount of activity, we may have had to bring the activity up higher. I don't normally have to get the weight loss, to get the fat loss off, and then we can bring it down once they shift to maintenance. So basically, the first thing I'll typically do is drop the activity and then see what goes on with their body weight. And then from there, like just seeing, okay, how many calories do they need to be eating based on that activity that they want to maintain to maintain the weight, to stabilize their weight. And then from there, I just typically peel off like a day per week. So basically like I said, first up is drop an activity. Okay, what's that do to your body weight? Okay, now let's figure out where your calories need to be. Okay, now let's do like this week, you track 5, don't track 2. Next week, you track 4, don't track 3. Next week, track 3, don't. So basically it becomes this like 5-6 week process of each week, you just peel a day off like that. You do a little less tracking, little less tracking, little less tracking. And then depending on the person, it's helpful. A lot of it is I guess when people come to me, a lot of times they're familiar with like kind of my style. So it's like they know even at the very beginning, they want to be paying attention to their body signals, like their hunger and fullness signals. So like, even though we haven't been like, I don't know, like when I started tracking, I didn't pay attention to that stuff at all. So it was like when I stopped tracking, I had to like start paying attention to that stuff for the first time. Where it's like in this situation, they've been paying attention to their body's feedback this whole time. So we might not have to do anything besides just peel a day off and lean into that structure they've created through their life and their habits. If there's somebody who's struggling with identifying when they're hungry, when they're full, and kind of those middle zone, I'll send them to another video. It's called a hunger fullness scale, and basically it's a scale from 1 to 10. 1 being you're starving, a 10 being you're stuffed, and a 0 being you're neither. And then there's just everything in between there. And so this way, it's like as they move away from tracking their calories, they can start to have a way to rate their hunger and fullness to help them get better in tune with their body's feedback. This way, there's like a quantifiable, like, okay, I was like a 4 here and an 8 there. So I'll use that hunger fullness scale. Or they'll use it to help kind of get more in tune with their hunger fullness signals if they need that. If they don't need that, then they don't need it.
It's like RPE for hunger.
Yep. And I'll tell people like, hey, the goal is to stay between like a 3 and like a 7.5. A 3 is just like you're hungry, but you're not starving. And a 7.5 is just you're full, but you're not stuffed. So, or 3 and an 8 being full. So this way they can play with that scale and they can try to hang out within that range to keep themselves from getting too hungry so they don't overeat, and then also not getting too full, because that's when they typically, you feel bloated and uncomfortable and have eaten a lot. So
yeah, it's tremendously interesting, the hunger cues, and how as a sort of, I guess, race, humans, we've forgot to some degree how to do this, or we think, excuse me, we forgot how to do this. We've not. It's obviously in there. It's it's part of what we are as humans. But I think, like you said in the early phases of this conversation, you talked about, you will send them a link about emotional hunger, emotional eating, things like that, like creating that awareness, because it does have a large effect. And even the evolution of society in general, where we look at geographically now, well, we can, back in the day, we would have had to go out and hunt food, and now it's there. We had to do everything manually, or a lot of things manually. Everything's kind of automated now, right? I'm sitting here talking to you halfway across the world on a computer with a coffee in my hand. But that I would have to go out and come and have a conversation with you back in the day and make some drink myself or whatever it was. So I think, explaining some of these without, giving too much information to someone, telling people, hey, like, this is kind of the reason why we may need to do X, Y, and Z, because, maybe back then it was just a byproduct of our environment and our lifestyle. This is why maybe we look the way we did. I mean, a great example is someone who was a higher body fat many, many centuries ago was someone who was considered wealthy and rich, right? Because they had a lot of resources. Yeah, it meant that they didn't obviously move a lot, so therefore they were of higher power, or whatever it might be, of wealth. And someone, who was very skinny would be maybe seen to be a peasant, because they're trying to find food all the time and shelter and warmth and all of these things. So I think kind of addressing these hunger cues, even from a physiological perspective of, okay, where does that come from and why has it changed? Because it is still, a massive uprise, the obesity levels and health conditions that are constantly there. And it always strikes me quite comical how we have to sort of come back full circle to learn something that's kind of inbuilt in us, but being aware of it and say, hey, to people, and using, like you said, this hunger scale, Stephen, going, well, am I actually hungry, or am I bored? Am I thirsty? Am I tired? I think tired's a big one. I know for me, a lot of the time I have to sort of remind myself now, even just in terms of a focus or a mood state. Like if I'm a little bit low, I go, you know what? 9 times out of 10, I just need more sleep. I'm a little bit tired and a little bit fatigued. And it's like it masks dramatically, how you feel. And I think especially in dieting, like hunger, wow, like it's day and night. If I'm underslept, man, that hunger's through the roof. Hence why we see people who are on night shifts eating a lot more. I want to talk about another scale, which is like one hedonic food scale, but also possibly more in terms of satiety, where we have, say, for example, a client is now tracking and they might say, hey, Steve, like I'm really hungry, or conversely, I'm really full. Do you have a scale or a tool where you teach them about how, for example, different food versus caloric density versus volume? So, for example, say we go like, hey, we've got white potato. I'm hungry. Okay, we'll have some more white potato, or maybe something that's a little bit more like, vegetable nature, fibrous vegetable, etc., versus something that might be, say, like a refined grain, like a cereal or something like that. You know what I mean? Who's like, I'm really full, but I need to get the calories in. Do you have a way of kind of teaching that and have like a sliding scale? Because I've found working with clients, they're surprised that potatoes are like one of the most satiating and lower calorie foods, because they're like, oh, chips. And I'm like, yeah, but and then we've got like, the cooking method. So I don't know if you have those questions, or if you have a tool of how to explain that, how someone can go get the same calories, but they can get like, less calories per bite or more calories per bite for like a similar volume, or if, to manipulate that around to kind of look after hunger cues. Does that make sense? Maybe I've sort of mangled that question a little bit too much.
No, I'm tracking with you completely. And it does come up some, like if basically every week, most weeks, I'll ask, hey, how was your appetite this week? Just, hey, were you hungry a lot? Were you not hungry a lot? Whatever. And if we notice that their appetite is creeping up, that's when we hop back into MyFitnessPal, start to look at their food choices. And then I can be like, oh, okay, well, we could modify this, modify that, so you get more food for less calories.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really get super micromanaging or granular about like having all these different, paying too much attention to that. Cause like, I don't know, like what, and this as well, like sometimes like, even though somebody might get more volume from, like, somebody could make like diet cookies, right? And get like a big pile of diet cookies and still be unsatisfied. Or they could have like 2 real cookies and be completely satisfied. So even though the volume is way less, like, that didn't actually hit the spot. So I try not to like be like, hey, you have to base everything off of like food volume. It's all about rising food volume. It's more of like, hey, how's your appetite? It's good. Okay, no changes. It's good, no changes. Oh, I'm getting pretty hungry. Let me look at your fiber intake. Are you getting the recommended intake of fiber? Okay. Then we can start to look at stuff like that. But I don't get too, I don't know, granular or micromanagey with like leaning everything towards high volume foods, if that makes sense.
It's probably more of a physique athlete or a comp prep question, I think, for that one. Like, I find that's more prevalent with that population, or people get into that habit if they do diet where they stay with that for a while, either on a recovery or reverse diet, and they forget that it's like, hey, like, it's not all about what you can eat the most of. And I know that this is quite sort of consistent with females, because they're generally on lower calories, they're smaller humans, and they're always trying to find these substitutes. But like you said, sometimes with eating these foods that are processed and filled with sugar, alcohols, and all of these fillers, if you will, they're not hitting the spot. So it's like, well, if you could fit in a percentage of your calories from the actual food, one, it's probably going to be better for you. And like you said, it actually hits the spot rather than always trying to maximize, and then spending more time in the kitchen and being food focused as well. It's probably kind of feeding, a negative behavior in the long run. Yep. I thought it'd be worth asking as well, just because I know that can make a big difference sometimes with people. It might be just that one thing, like, hey, all foods aren't equal. Like, you can sort of go, well, if you did want a little bit more, you can just easily just swap a food out. And at dinner time, okay, cool, I walked a little bit more today, or I'm a little bit hungry, cool, I'm going to choose this carb source rather than this carb source, and bang. Or vice versa. You used an example later on where it's like, oh shit, I got a lot of calories left for the day. It's like, okay, we might not need to eat all of them, but maybe sitting down to something that's really high fiber is not going to be, the best outcome. Maybe we go with something a little bit more calorically dense.
Yep.
So sorry.
Just to add something to that real quick, that's where it's like a lot of this just really is a part of the process, and it comes down to like individuals. So it's like on my end, like, it's kind of the same thing with like, hey, like, should I drink diet soda? Should I not drink diet soda? Should I eat chips? Should I not eat chips? Should I eat cookies? So it's just like, a lot of times it's just like, what does that do for you? Like, if you drink diet soda and it curbs your desire for sweets, then you keep it in there. But like, if you drink diet soda and it makes you want more sweets, then maybe we get rid of diet sodas. So it's like same thing with like chips. If somebody can like eat a little bit of chips and it hits the spot, cool. But if I start eating chips, I have the whole bag. And it's like, okay, well, maybe we don't need the chips, So it's like, that's where I think of like my job is more of like just kind of knowing the alternatives. This way, like, somebody tries something, because it sounds like you're a similar system. You guys talk every week, because we talk every week. So nothing's going to happen in 7 days. So it's like, hey, we're going to try this thing for 7 days. But if you're talking about being hungry and having high cravings and all these things, we'll take a look at what you're doing. And then just based on my experience, I can say, okay, we've tried the diet sodas and having the chips in the house and stuff. Why don't we try the opposite of that? Why don't we try taking out the diet sodas and just doing more waters? And maybe we do more of like high volume foods and less. So just like, just knowing, like, just running experiments. Because like, that's the consistent thing I hear from clients, is like, this whole thing for them just becomes a process of like finding, okay, what fruits and veggies do they like? What high protein foods do they like? It's like, they're like, hey, along the way, I have to try a lot of stuff that I don't like. It's just a part of it. Like, it's just a part of the process. I have to try different things. And if I don't like them, oh, well, I'll just never eat that again. But like, it's just trial and error, finding what works for you. And then once you find it, then all of a sudden you got your key foods that help you hit your things. And you kind of know how your self works, and what makes you crave things and what doesn't.
Yeah. It is very much a journey of self-discovery, and that kind of, to underscore that, because there's probably quite a good message in what you just said there, Steve, in terms of, you introduce sometimes the tracking to someone, or we start this journey, this process, and people go, oh, it's kind of hard, or maybe they're like, it's going to have to do this forever. And it's like, hey, like, I always say to people, like, the nutritional literacy is like reading literacy. Like, when you learned to read, was it easy? No, it was probably very hard. And you had to learn how to write words and enunciate, and your vocabulary grew over time. I'm like, no one just tracks and is like an expert next week. You know what I mean? But I don't know. I find with clients who are more, in adulthood, they can sometimes be a little bit sort of like almost entitled in a way, where they're like, like, this should just come to me. Like, I should know this, or why do I have to do this? And I'm like, hey, like, it's like anything. Like, I usually use their job as an example. I'm like, when you first learned this, was it easy? No. I'm like, right. So same thing. Like, the only reason I'm able to teach this is because I started from zero and I just made all these mistakes, and I learned and I educated and listened and read. Like, you don't need to know it like I know it, but there is, like, it's like basic maths and English. Like, you want to know how to, add and subtract and divide, and you want to know how to read and enunciate. You don't have to be like a documentary Attenborough, but you need this certain level in life. And then people sort of, I found that a metaphor seems to really, as of the last sort of year, it really helps people. They go, oh, cool. I'm like, yeah, think about it like that. Like, remember, like, you're not always going to be where you are. Like, it's going to get better. You are going to understand it, and it's not forever. Like, you're going to sort of evolve from the current skill set. And then people are sort of more like, oh yeah, okay. Like, let's get back in, right? Rather than it being like, oh, when am I going to wake up and everything's just going to be, I'm just going to know everything, or I'm just going to like understand nutrition. And I think maybe it's because people just take it for granted, like as if it's something that, they should have all of this knowledge on straight away. To like, well, it's just food, right? It's like, yeah, but is it? Like, we eat it every day, but maybe there's more to this. So I don't know if you want to add into that, but it's something
Just
I've
a
found.
bit. It's just a really good observation. Like, that's a really good add-on. Like, because it's like as much stuff as, and you've even quoted it today, like as much stuff that's put out on like getting away from tracking, there is still massive, like we started with massive value on the tracking side of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, I've just found that like, if somebody has never gone through a phase like that, it's almost like they're always just guessing with their eyes closed. It's like, well, I'm going to try not eating potatoes for a week. Okay. I'm not going to eat corn for a week. Okay. Now, but I only had peanuts yesterday. Why didn't I lose weight?
Yeah.
It was just like, there's a missing piece. There's like, it doesn't all make sense. But then once they track for a little period of time, now they have all these frames of reference for total calorie intakes, and how it's not just one day, but we have to look at weeks and months, and like how all this stuff adds up. And it's just like, I don't know, that tracking just takes away a lot of the unknown, and it just, I don't know, I've just found it so helpful for everyone who's gone through it.
Yeah, it is. It's like this initial, like, I'm just like, it's like riding a bike. I'm like, guys, just do your training wheels, just do your hours. Or you're driving a car, just get your learners. Like, you got to go through it. You might not become a fully fledged racing driver, but you kind of need to know the basics, right? Like the clutch, the gears, the indicators, the road rules. And then, you can further it if you want, or you can just stay there, but you need that level. And like you said, people just go for these big, like, I'm just going to cut carbs. And then you're like, okay, right. Or I'm just going to cut sugar out, or I'm just going to low fat or ketogenic. And I think that's kind of where people fall. It's almost like they're about to go into the ocean, and then there's this like little catchment area where like they go into this water, where it's like maybe the tides wash it away, and then before it comes up to the sand, and everyone's just getting caught right before the actual, it's like, no, don't just take one of these big pieces and throw it out. And then, you get these zealots online are like, yep, well, ketogenic's the way because it worked for me. It's the only way I lost weight. It's like, okay, well, that must mean it works for everyone then, right? It's like, no, you're missing a bigger principle here. You just manipulated energy balance. And like you said, by giving people these skill sets, it's allow us to remove, rigidity and sort of having a binary approach, or just going, well, this is the diet. It's like, no. There's many types of diet, and there's many ways to achieve, it's just fat loss and muscle gain, but it's about you as an individual. So I think if you understanding those fundamentals, you can kind of bridge that gap. See, before we get into rapid fire questions, just one or two more before we go, if you've got time, please. I wanted to ask, what are the biggest mistakes you see people make that you work with? And what are some of those mediums, I guess, apart from what you've already mentioned, that you use to kind of bridge that gap? It might be people you don't work with. It might be things you see on social media, like things I've just said, cutting out big food groups. We've talked about that. Or maybe there's other things that you observe in your space where you're like, wow, this seems to be a really common thing that people are getting wrong or overlooking.
I would say there's a couple that just pop into my head. One is just, especially in the beginning, like not having enough of a plan, like planning in advance for how they're going to hit certain targets, like how they're going to get their fruits and veggies that week or how they're going to get their protein that week. Trying to go through the week, but without having put any forethought into like, okay, well, where are these going to come from? Like I didn't go to the groceries, I didn't go to the grocery store and get this stuff, but somehow I think I'm magically going to hit them, even though none of it's at my house. So I'd say one is just like the lack of planning is definitely, and I'm the same way with stuff. It's like I got so many things, and we all do on our list that like sometimes it's just like, man, I don't want to plan another thing. Like I'll figure it out. But then like the whole week goes by and we were like 50% in terms of hitting protein, fruits, and veggies. Or it's like just a little bit of planning at the beginning of the week. Then it's like, okay, we would have hit all those things. That's one. It's just like not enough forethought and planning into things.
That's
It.
that's really good. Just quickly to interject, because I find that's a pitfall for a lot of people. When you do get that issue with a client that you're working with, what are some of the mediums that you choose? Because people go, oh, well, we can go, we'll meal prep. And then people go, well, I don't have time and I don't want to do it. And you go, well, how important is it to you? So, but then obviously we can bridge the gap. Now we've got all these meal prep services, or you can even buy the food delivered, but you still got to make it. I guess quickly, is there any sort of strategies you would give to people? Say, hey, look, from if you're really dedicated, you can do this, or, because people are often time poor, like you said, but sometimes they have this fight or this sort of mismatch between, well, like they don't want to fully meal prep. So I'm like, do we get them to make more dinner and then they've got lunch for the next day? Like, how do you maybe go about kind of bridging that gap? Because that's probably actually really critical. We didn't cover that one.
The simplest way is I just have people go through like, hey, what are going to be your breakfasts this week? And
Yep.
so I don't care if like they make it or if it's a meal prep service they bought, but like while we're on the consultation, like let's spend 10 minutes. Okay, what are your breakfasts this week?
Yep.
What are your lunches this week? What are your dinners this week?
Yep.
And like knowing that they can again toss out anytime, they're not stuck to that, but like
Yep.
this way they at least have a plan A. And so I've just found just like literally sitting down and just going through that. Now when they go to the store, if they're going to be cooking most of their foods, they know what to buy. Because I've
Yes.
just found like the way I used to shop and the way most people shop before they start something like this is just like you just go to the store and like, all right, I'm gonna get some peppers and I'm gonna get a loaf of bread. I'm gonna get some peanut butter, and then you get home and there's no meals. There's nothing. It's just a bunch of random foods. It's like I got a pound of bacon and a bell pepper. Like, what am I gonna do with this? Like so it's like I've just found like building the meals up front. This way, when they go to the store, it's like
Yeah.
like that's my breakfasts. Here are my three options for breakfast, and maybe two of those are frozen meals, and the ones that it's like doesn't have to be all foods they make, but they have it on paper. What are their breakfasts? What are their lunch? What are their dinners? What are their snacks? Now they have a plan. So that's the easiest way I find to bridge that gap.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's always say to clients, something I've developed is I'm like, look, because we are creatures of habit, sometimes females are like, I need more variety, and then males are just like, I'm like, you can eat, you don't just have to eat this, bro. It's like that's really bland. You can add some, but that's a generalization, but I see that, men were more sort of simplistic. But I'll say you like have three options for breakfast, but they can include very similar ingredients. And I always say like same breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm like sweet, savory, quick. So it might be like cool. The sweet options like oats, berries, honey, protein powder, whatever it is. The quick one might be the same, but you blend it up. You might put some peanut butter in there, whatever it is, and then savory might be some eggs on toast with avocado. Bang. And I always say to people, like, there's so many ways to make that combination too, right? Because people are so concerned with like variety, but then they figure out like they're eating the same thing. So a lot of the time they have these fears which are not real. They're just in their head, and then they do it, and I'm like, you're eating the same thing anyway. But yeah, it's again, it's finding that line between not giving someone too many options, but giving them enough so they can go, like, all right, I've got this simple structure. Like you said, I'm forethinking rather than just completely winging it in the early days. But at the same time, you've got something in place where you're like, well, at least I have a plan.
Yep. Yep.
Otherwise, you end up, like you said, with a whole load of meat and a bell pepper. And that's an epic mealtime episode in the making.
The end of the week rolls around. It's like, I didn't eat any, I didn't hit my targets, but which rolls into like back to your first question, which is like what just I'll mention one other, I guess we'll say,
Yeah, go
I
for
don't
it.
know, habit that I've noticed makes a big difference. And that's reviewing your your nutrition, your diet every day. So
Yeah.
either at the end of every day or at the beginning of the next day, looking at, okay, in regards to my outcomes, in my system, it'll be different based on what system you're going through. Mine is protein, fruits, fruits, veggies, protein, and calories. I've said that so many times in the last hour, it's getting mixed up. But it's like at the end of every 24-hour period, like, did I hit those targets?
Yeah.
Just review this way. It doesn't get to the end of the week and like somebody realizes that their fruits and veggies were low all week just because they hadn't double checked it or like looked at it. But like if we stop in like literally 30 seconds, like every morning, I just like look at the previous day for like, it takes me no more than 60 seconds. I'm like, how was my protein? How was my fruit? How was my veggies? My veggies were a little low. I need to like make sure I get enough veggies today. Like just that daily review. Again, it doesn't have to be more than 60 seconds, but like that is super helpful.
Yeah, I like that actually. I'm gonna perhaps not steal but utilize that one. I think, I talk to people about just have a little look or do at least like put a day in like your template or what you normally eat, because we get complacent and then we're like, yeah, we're eating that, and then you review it and you're like, oh, I'm not eating that. And then there's these little gaps. So I think, like you said, little and often is really good, and having these daily reviews, because as you said, it's we got stuff going on in our life and it's busy, but like, hey, if it's important, and it is important because you got to eat, right, and your health's priority, just taking that time, making it a habit. Okay, you know what, before I go bed, or before I wrap up for the day, before I leave the office, I'm just gonna have a quick look, just make sure I got the key things in there. And if not, okay, what do I need to do, especially if it's something where people they're trying to make a conscious effort and improvement on it, Steve.
You said a key piece in there. And there's this last thing, and we could shift is like you said, when I'm leaving the office, like that's what I tell people is just find a spot in the day. So that way it's like, it's another habit. Like at the same time every day is when you do your diet review. Like mine's every morning with breakfast. I look at the previous day. Some people, it's like as they're getting ready for bed, they'll think of the current day.
Yes.
But it's like basically find a spot where it's now a habit in your life where every day at this time, not even necessarily time, but like breakfast can occur a variety of times, but when I eat, my brain knows, when I eat breakfast, I think about the previous day. And so I don't even have to think about reviewing the previous day because it's become such a habit.
Yes. No, I like that. I think it's great. You sort of got to tie it to something in the day, right? To kind of solidify that behavior. It's like, I might pair it with something like, what's an anchor in the day where you're always going to be doing a certain activity or a thing. It's kind of like a stretching. If it's just really hard habit, I get it. It's not something you want to sit down and do, but I'm like, put a podcast in or put some comedy on Netflix, like do something where you're like, oh, I'm distracted. I'm present enough for the activity, but I can kind of make the time pass starting small. And then it's like, okay, well, when I do this, I always do this. All right, cool. And then you just automatically do, oh yeah, I'm just sitting down before I wrap up my day. Or like you said, at breakfast, just having a review, and it's pretty powerful over time. Moving into the rapid fire questions, Steve, bit more fun, bit lighthearted in nature before we move into the final question. First one is, if you could choose a superpower, what would it be and why? You can completely make one up, my friend. There's no rules here.
I think flying would be pretty cool. That's the first one off the top of my head. Just to be able to fly around.
Mate, you can't go wrong with flying, can you? Especially with at the minute. That'd be great.
Yep.
We could have done this podcast in person if that was the case.
Just teleport. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, shit. I'll be back in a second. I forgot the mic. Damn. Back into the second one is food related, of course. Why not? We'll have this. Favorite meal, or if I put it into a context, if you had sort of one last epic meal, or if you just could like have your own epic set menu for your friends that were going to come around, and it was your favorite thing. It could be entree, main, dessert, drink, or it might just be one food item. I'm not sure, but what would be Steve's favorite foods?
A few things popped up. I'm just going to go with this, like a big burger, like a big cheeseburger with all the fixings, fries, and a milkshake. I think I would just go super classic like that.
Yeah. What flavor milkshake?
Either chocolate or vanilla. Chocolate or vanilla.
Yeah. It's funny side note. It's amazing how well chips go with milkshake. Like literally, like the salt and the sweet, it just works. Like I remember I was at McDonald's, was doing this vlog a couple of months back, and I was like, dip the chips in the milkshake. I've seen it done. Damn, it works, man. I'm like, I'm like, that's some crazy shit. But like, it's like PB and J or like jam and cheese, right? Jam and cream cheese. It just works, man. So yeah, you can't go wrong with a good burger. And my last rapid fire question would be for you. I would say let's go with why it is COVID, or why it's sort of been on and travel's not been, an ability. Where would you wake up anywhere in the world tomorrow if that was a possibility?
Potentially in the Sahara Desert.
Okay, all right, okay, this is different. Why?
It'd just be cool to be out there with basically, I'd want to be like out like with nothing and just to be able to look up at the stars.
Right.
And just like total darkness and just see nothing but millions of stars.
Are you in quite a built up area then, Steve?
I'm in middle United States now, but I lived in Los Angeles, which is, I'm sure, massive city.
Yeah.
And so I was there for 4 years. And before that, I was in Sacramento, which is another big city in California. So I've been in big cities for years. And so it's like, I think maybe that's why that's in there. It's like now all of a sudden I'm like, I just want to like, be on a mountain with like my core homies and stuff and hang out. So
for sure. You Kansas would be pretty, like you said, you have some open space there, wouldn't you?
Definitely.
Be pretty good. But yeah, man, Sahara Desert, you don't get much more isolated than that, I guess, with just open space. A couple of camels as well, just a couple of supplies, nice little tent there, and a couple of cheeseburgers, and you'd be right, mate.
Right? Doesn't that sound great? Like what?
Just fly there and back. It's done.
I got my night planned, so I'm doing tonight.
That's it, brother. And my last question, which is the question I ask all my guests, is could you or can you please identify a fear that you've had in your life? Could be current, could have been something in the past that you've had, what it was and how you overcame it, what you learned from this said fear, or maybe it's something that you're still working through.
Probably just like most people, like public speaking. So even like stuff like this, I used to get super nervous for.
Yeah.
Like when I first started doing podcasts, like was it 5 years ago, maybe, like super nervous for them. I still get like nervous to some degree.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest thing that's helped is just doing it more and more. And like, I mean, the thing everyone says, you just do it more and you get more comfortable with it. I think that's helped a lot. And just like having a few that times that like maybe it didn't go awesome. You're like, you know what? I lived, like,
yeah,
I'm better for it. And I like the downstream effect of it. It was like I found like once I started tackling like higher fears, all the littler fears below it become easy. Because it's like I did this thing, which scared the hell out of me. So it like all this little stuff just got way easier. So I love that of it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great fear that a lot of people have. And yeah, it's desensitization. It's like anything. You just get better. Like what we've been talking about today. You got to do it. It's the only way you get better. Everything's hard before it's easy, right? And then the more you do it, refine it, and practice it, it just becomes second nature. So I can definitely resonate, especially in the early days of podcasting. Even someone who loves a chat, as my audience knows, you're a little bit fearful, but it's good because it usually means that if you get nervous for something, it usually means you have some sort of care factor involved with it, especially in this space, which is really good for what we do. Steve, thank you for being so generous with your time. I really appreciate it. For people out there who want a little bit more, they want to follow along, they want to check out some of these resources, which we'll link below for all the listeners and the watchers, guys. Where's the best place to connect with you, Steve, and the best work or whatever you think might be relevant for the listeners and watchers today?
So website is just stevetaylorrd.com, Instagram @stevetaylorrd. Same thing with YouTube. And then in terms of work, checking out the 3D Muscle Journeys Vault, which is just a collection of these online video courses. And in the 3DMJ Vault, I have 2 courses in there. One's called Sustainable Fat Loss. That one's completely free. It's 4 chapters. It's got the chapter on how to track. It's got the chapter on emotion management. It's got the chapter about kind of beginning with the end in mind. So check that out. And then the other course in there is on transitioning away from tracking. And that's where if you're somebody who has been tracking for a long time and you're just sick of tracking, or you just want to give it a go, it's a process. And it's a course that Eric and I made. Eric starts off talking about the science of the concepts that I will then be I basically present on after that, the process for how to move away from tracking.
Yeah. Yeah, no, phenomenal stuff. And again, I'll put all those links in the description and highly recommend them as someone who has, been following along for many years and consume most of those resources. They're really great, especially for people coming in. I find that they're really easy to grasp and they're very well presented and people can absorb and apply them really easily, which I think is key, especially in the common theme today, which has been, the sustainability. So, Steve, thank you once again. I really appreciate that. Guys, for everyone listening, thank you for tuning in as ever. If you are on iTunes, Spotify, Twitch, any of the auditory platforms, please leave a rating and a review. Most of you listen on iTunes and Spotify. It's really easy. If you just click in and scroll down, as long as you're not driving and it's safe, leave us a rating and review. Let us know what you think of the channel, what you thought of maybe this episode. And if you've got any comments or questions, drop them in the YouTube for all of you watching along there. And we can obviously perhaps derive some more information in the future if you want any more information specifically. And of course, subscribe, hit that bell icon. I've got to say it, guys, I really appreciate it. A lot of new followers lately. So thank you for listening in. And of course, until our next episode, in the meantime, stay fearless.